The first whisper of the train arrived in London on a Tuesday morning in late January 1945, carried in a crumpled cigarette paper extracted from the heel of a Polish courier's boot. Major Jeffrey Ashworth spread the tissue-thin document across his desk at Broadway Buildings, the nondescript headquarters of the Secret Intelligence Service, and studied the pencil scratches through his magnifying glass. The message had traveled 3 weeks through occupied territory, passed from partisan to priest to farmer to smuggler, and the handwriting trembled with either cold or fear. Reichsbank convoy departed Breslau, January 14th, destination unknown. Cargo, AU bars, foreign currency, artifacts. Train diverted from standard evacuation routes. Believed static somewhere Owl Mountains region. Guards, Wehrmacht, possibly SS. Locals report unusual nighttime railway activity near Waldenburg. Ashworth lit his pipe and considered the implications. By January 1945, the Reich was collapsing like a house built on sand. The Red Army had crossed into Silesia. American forces were pressing toward the Rhine. The Nazis were hemorrhaging territory, and with it, the vast quantities of looted wealth they had systematically stripped from conquered nations since 1939. The Reichsbank's evacuation of its reserves had been anticipated, desperate men protecting desperate treasures. But this particular shipment had gone dark. He reached for his telephone. "Give me Colonel Donovan's office in Paris. Osliaison. Priority Alpha." Outside his frosted window, London shivered under a gray sky. Somewhere 1,500 miles to the east, in mountains he had never seen, a train waited in the snow. Part 1. The Convergence. The cold in Lower Silesia that winter was biblical. Major Ashworth had read the meteorological reports. Temperatures dropping to -20 Celsius, snowdrifts that could swallow a man to his chest. But reading about cold and experiencing it were different animals entirely. He had never been to Poland, would likely never go, but he had learned to see it through other people's eyes. The agents he recruited, the resistance fighters he coordinated, the sources he cultivated across the chessboard of occupied Europe. His primary eyes in the region belonged to a woman named Zofia Kowalska, though he knew her only as Nightingale. She worked as a secretary in the Waldenburg town administration, a position that gave her access to railway schedules, supply requisitions, and the loose talk of German officers who assumed Polish women were either deaf or irrelevant. Nightingale's reports arrived irregularly, the nature of clandestine communication, but they arrived, which meant she was alive, cautious, and extraordinarily brave. The second report came via neutral Sweden, transmitted through a network of fishing boats and diplomatic pouches. It confirmed the first, unusual German activity along the Waldenburg-Gilenia-Gora railway corridor. Multiple sightings of a heavily guarded train, static on a siding, covered with camouflage netting. Local workers conscripted to reinforce a tunnel entrance. Engineers surveying mountain terrain. And most tellingly, the presence of Reichsbank officials, men in civilian clothes who arrived by staff car and departed looking worried. Ashworth drafted a memorandum for the Joint Intelligence Committee outlining what they knew and, more importantly, what they didn't. The Nazi gold reserves were substantial. Estimates suggested hundreds of millions in Reichsmarks worth of foreign currency, gold bars, jewelry, and artifacts looted from museums, banks, and private collections across Europe. The Reichsbank had been evacuating these reserves as Soviet forces advanced, but the trail had gone cold somewhere in the Sudeten Mountains. If the intelligence was accurate, and if the train could be located, the Allies would recover not just material wealth, but evidence. Documentation of systematic looting that could prove invaluable in post-war prosecutions. More immediately, securing the gold would deny it to the Nazis, who might use it to fund Ratlins for escaping war criminals or finance underground resistance in the event of defeat. The proposal he submitted was elegant in its simplicity. Insert a small OSS team into the region, link them with local resistance networks, locate the train, and hold the position until advancing Allied forces could secure it. The alternative, waiting for the Red Army to overrun the area, would mean the gold disappearing into Soviet hands, never to be seen again. The authorization came back within 48 hours, stamped with Eisenhower's approval. Operation Emberlight was born 300 miles southeast in a forest clearing outside the village of Volbjik. Zofia Kowalska wrapped her scarf tighter against the wind and waited. The rendezvous was scheduled for 3 in the morning, a time when even German patrols preferred the warmth of their barracks to the frozen roads. She had been standing in the shadow of a burned-out barn for 20 minutes, long enough for the cold to penetrate her wool coat and settle into her bones. She was 34 years old, a widow. Her husband had died in the September campaign of 1939, shot during the defense of Warsaw, and she had been working for the resistance since the occupation began. Her role was unglamorous but vital. She collected information, memorized train schedules, copied documents, and passed everything upstream to the network commanders who coordinated with London. She had never fired a gun, never planted a bomb, never done anything that would merit a line in a history book. She simply watched, remembered, and reported. The man who emerged from the tree line was younger than she expected, perhaps 25, with a lean build of someone who had spent months living rough. He wore a German army greatcoat, looted or traded, and moved with the careful economy of someone perpetually conserving energy. "Nightingale," he whispered in Polish. "Yes, you're late." German checkpoint on the Schweidnitz Road. Had to wait for them to finish their inspection. He handed her a canvas satchel. From London, via Stockholm. Food, medical supplies, radio crystals, and a message for you. She opened the oilskin envelope and read by moonlight. The message was brief, written in a simple book code they had established months earlier. Priority: locate static train, Owl Mountains region. Report exact position, guard strength, cargo status. Expect Allied personnel insertion within 14 days. Acknowledge receipt. She looked up. Tell them I acknowledge. Tell them I'll need help. The Germans have the entire valley locked down. Checkpoints, patrols, work permits. I can't move freely in the mountains. I'll pass it along. The courier paused. Is it true? About the gold. I don't know what's on that train, Zofia said carefully. But whatever it is, the Germans are terrified of losing it. I've seen the officers' faces when they think no one's watching. They look like men who've lost something precious and know they'll hang for it. The courier nodded and melted back into the forest. Zofia waited 5 minutes, then walked the long way back to Waldenburg, keeping to the shadows, moving like a ghost through the occupied night. In Berlin, 400 miles northwest, Sturmbannführer Ernst Richter sat in his commandeered office in the Reichsbank headquarters and contemplated the extent of his failure. The building around him was a mausoleum. Half the staff evacuated, files burned, vaults emptied. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, even if no one dared say it aloud. The only question now was how to salvage something from the wreckage. Richter was 41, a career officer who had joined the SS in 1934, back when it seemed like a path to advancement rather than damnation. He had a degree in economics from Heidelberg, had spent the pre-war years working in the Reichsbank's foreign exchange division, and had been assigned to oversee the evacuation of the bank's reserves when the Eastern Front began to collapse. It was a job that required discretion, competence, and a willingness to operate in moral gray zones. The train, his train, represented the culmination of years of systematic looting. Gold bars stamped with the eagles of occupied nations. Foreign currency stripped from central banks. Jewelry confiscated from Jewish deportees, melted down and recast. Art objects too valuable to destroy, too incriminating to keep. The entire manifest read like an indictment. And Richter knew that if the Allies captured it intact, the evidence would hang him as surely as a noose. His orders from Berlin had been clear. Evacuate the reserves to a secure location, keep them out of Soviet hands, and await further instructions. But Berlin was burning, the command structure was disintegrating, and further instructions would likely never come. Richter had made his own decision. Hide the train somewhere defensible, somewhere the Allies couldn't easily reach, and use it as a bargaining chip when the time came. The location he had chosen was a disused railway tunnel in the Owl Mountains, reinforced during the war as part of a larger underground complex that had never been completed. The tunnel was deep, defendable, and far enough from major roads that it wouldn't attract casual attention. He had stationed a platoon of Wehrmacht soldiers to guard it, supplemented by a squad of Waffen-SS men whose loyalty he could count on. The train itself was camouflaged, the tunnel entrance sealed, and the surrounding forest patrolled regularly. But security was relative. Richter had heard the rumors, partisan activity in the region, unusual radio traffic, locals asking too many questions. He had interrogated 3 suspected resistance members in the past month, and while they had broken under questioning, their answers suggested a network far more extensive than he had anticipated. Someone was watching. Someone was reporting. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the ruins of Berlin. The city was dying, and he was dying with it, but he would not surrender cheaply. If the Allies wanted the gold, they would have to take it from him. Part 2. Insertion. The OSS team that dropped into Poland on the night of February 7th, 1945, consisted of 4 men. Captain Jack Henley, the team leader, a former Yale history professor who spoke fluent German. Sergeant Tommy Briggs, a demolitions expert from Kentucky. Corporal David Klein, a German Jewish refugee who served as interpreter and interrogator. And Lieutenant Marc Dubois, a French resistance veteran attached to the operation as a liaison. They jumped from a converted B-24 Liberator at 12,000 feet, landing in a frozen field 30 miles south of Waldenburg. The drop was clean, no injuries, no lost equipment, and within 2 hours they had buried their parachutes, cached their excess gear, and begun moving north toward the rendezvous point. The temperature was minus 15 Celsius, cold enough that their breath froze in the air, cold enough that exposed skin burned within seconds. Henley had studied the operational brief until he could recite it from memory. Their mission was threefold: link up with local resistance, locate the train, and establish a defensive perimeter until mechanized Allied units could secure the area. Intelligence estimated they had perhaps 2 weeks before the advancing Red Army overran the region, which meant speed and precision were everything. The resistance contact found them first. She emerged from a stand of pines just before dawn, a small figure in a dark coat, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the terrain intimately. "Captain Henley," she said in accented English. "That's me. You must be Nightingale." Zofia Kowalska studied the 4 Americans with an expression somewhere between relief and skepticism. They looked competent, well-equipped, disciplined, alert, but they also looked foreign, out of place in the frozen landscape. "Welcome to Poland," she said dryly. "Try not to get killed." She led them to a farmhouse 3 miles north, a stone building that had been abandoned when its owners fled the advancing front. The interior was freezing, but it offered concealment and a place to plan. Zofia spread a hand-drawn map across a table and pointed to a valley in the mountains. "The train is here," she said. "Tunnel entrance, heavily guarded. I've counted at least 30 soldiers, maybe more, Wehrmacht regulars and SS. They patrol in shifts 3 times daily. The tunnel itself is sealed, reinforced doors, probably mined. I haven't been able to get close enough to see inside." Henley studied the map. The valley was a natural choke point, surrounded by steep forested slopes. One road in, one road out. Defensible, but also a trap. "How certain are you about the location?" "Completely certain. I've seen the guards. I've watched them unload supplies. And I've talked to the locals, railway workers, farmers, people who live in the area. Everyone knows something's there, even if they don't know exactly what." "What about the German commander? Do we know who's running the operation?" "SS officer. I don't have his name, but I know he's from Berlin. Reichsbank. The soldiers call him the accountant, which tells you everything you need to know." Henley nodded. An SS officer from the Reichsbank would be intelligent, cautious, and unlikely to surrender without a fight. This wouldn't be a simple smash and grab. They would need leverage. "All right," he said. "Here's the plan. We observe for 48 hours, map the guard rotations, identify weak points. Then we insert a small team, Briggs and Klein, to confirm the train's presence and gather intelligence on the cargo. Once we know what we're dealing with, we call in the cavalry." Zofia raised an eyebrow. "And if the Germans discover you?" "Then we improvise. For 2 days, the team watched the valley from concealed positions in the surrounding hills. They took turns on observation duty, rotating every 4 hours, documenting everything: guard shifts, supply runs, patrol patterns, vehicle movements. The Germans were professional but not paranoid. They relied on the remoteness of the location and the harshness of the weather to deter intruders. On the third night, Briggs and Klein descended into the valley. They moved slowly, pausing frequently to listen, following a frozen stream that provided natural cover. The tunnel entrance was exactly where Zofia had indicated, a concrete portal set into the hillside, reinforced with steel doors, flanked by 2 guard posts. Floodlights illuminated the immediate area, but the surrounding forest remained dark. Klein used binoculars to scan the entrance. I count 6 guards visible, probably more inside. The doors are definitely sealed. Looks like a blast lock, maybe air-gapped. No way we're getting through without heavy equipment. Can you see the train? Negative. Too dark. But look there on the left. Ventilation shaft. Steam coming out. Something's running inside. Probably a generator. They watched for another hour, gathering details, then withdrew. By dawn, they were back at the farmhouse, cold and exhausted but alive. Henley listened to their report and made his decision. We need confirmation. We need to see inside that tunnel. Zofia, do any of the local workers have access? She shook her head. Not anymore. The Germans sealed it 2 weeks ago. Only officers go in now. Then we'll have to create access. Henley looked at Briggs. How much explosive would it take to blow the ventilation shaft? Briggs grinned. Not much, but it'll make noise. Every German in 10 miles will come running. That's the idea, Henley said. We blow the shaft, create a diversion, and while they're scrambling to respond, Klein and I go in through the breach. 10 minutes in and out, photograph everything we can. Then we extract and call in the coordinates. It was a terrible plan, reckless, dangerous, and unlikely to succeed, but it was the only plan they had. Part 3, the breach. They struck at midnight, when the temperature dropped to -22 and the guards huddled miserably in their posts. Briggs placed the charges precisely, shaping the blast to maximize penetration while minimizing external noise. When he triggered the detonator, the explosion was a muffled thump, felt more than heard, and the ventilation shaft collapsed in a shower of concrete and steel. Chaos erupted immediately. Alarms wailed, floodlights swept the hillside, and soldiers poured from the guard posts. Du Bois and Briggs opened fire from concealed positions on the ridge, drawing the German response away from the breach. Klein and Henley sprinted across the open ground, dropped into the collapsed shaft, and descended into darkness. The interior of the tunnel was a cathedral of shadows. Emergency lighting cast faint pools of illumination across a scene from a fever dream. A locomotive and 6 freight cars, camouflage netting draped across the roof, and everywhere, the dull gleam of gold. Henley pulled out his camera and began shooting. Crates stenciled with Reichsbank markings, open to reveal stacks of gold bars. Suitcases filled with currency, dollars, pounds, francs, Swiss francs. Wooden boxes containing jewelry, watches, dental gold, objects that had once belonged to people whose names were lost to history. And in the final car, shrouded in canvas, paintings, old masters stripped from museums across Europe, waiting to be sold or hidden. Jesus Christ, Klein Vispirit. It's all here. Everything they stole. Keep shooting, Henley said. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they figure out where we are. Above them, gunfire rattled through the forest. Du Bois's voice crackled over the radio. Henley, you need to move. They're bringing up reinforcements. I count at least 20, maybe more. Copy. We're extracting now. They climbed back through the breach, emerging into a scene of pure chaos. Tracers streaked through the darkness, illuminating the snow in brief, stroboscopic flashes. Briggs was laying down, suppressing fire from a ridge. Du Bois had fallen back to his secondary position. Klein and Henley sprinted for the tree line, bullets snapping past their heads, and dove into cover just as a mortar round detonated where they had been standing seconds before. Everyone alive? Henley gasped into the radio. 3 affirmatives came back. They withdrew through the forest in a fighting retreat, trading fire with pursuing Germans, using the terrain and darkness to their advantage. By dawn, they had broken contact, circling back to the farmhouse through a series of evasive maneuvers that left them exhausted but alive. Zofia was waiting with hot tea and a grim expression. Half the German garrison is searching the valley. They know someone was inside. Good, Henley said. Let them search. We got what we came for. He held up the camera. Proof. Documentation. Everything we need to prosecute. He radioed London with the coordinates, the photographs, and a request for immediate Allied action. The response came back within 6 hours. Hold position. Mechaniser units en route. Estimated arrival, 72 hours. All they had to do was survive 3 more days. Part 4. The Siege. Ernst Richter knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had run out of options, that his time was running out. The breach had been audacious, a commando raid, almost certainly Allied, coordinated with local partisans. They had seen inside the tunnel. They knew what was there, and that meant the information was already flowing westward, transmitted through channels he couldn't interdict. He had 2 choices: defend the train until Berlin sent new orders that would never come, or destroy the evidence and disappear into the chaos of the collapsing Reich. The first option would end with his capture and trial. The second offered the possibility of escape, but it meant obliterating the one asset that might buy him clemency. He chose a third option. Richter assembled his officers in the tunnel, standing before the train like a priest before an altar. Gentlemen, he said, we are going to negotiate. The Allies want this train. They want the gold, they want the evidence, they want the symbolic victory. We're going to give it to them, but on our terms. His plan was simple. Use the train as a bargaining chip. Reach out to the Allies through neutral channels. Offer to surrender the cargo intact in exchange for safe passage for himself and his men. The Allies would accept. They always accepted when the prize was large enough. And he would live to see the wars end somewhere neutral, perhaps Sweden or Switzerland, rather than at the end of a rope in Nuremberg. The first challenge was making contact. Richter sent a message through a Catholic priest in Waldenburg who had connections to the resistance. The message was straightforward. We are prepared to discuss terms for the transfer of assets currently under German protection. Guarantee of safe passage required. Response requested within 48 hours. The message reached Zofia, who forwarded it to Henley, who forwarded it to London. The response came back quickly and was everything Richter had feared. No negotiation with war criminals. Secure the train. Await Allied arrival. Henley read the message to his team and grimaced. They're not playing. We hold the perimeter, keep the Germans bottled up, and wait for armor to arrive. And if the Germans decide to blow the tunnel? Du Bois asked. Then we lose everything, Henley said, which means we don't let them. The final confrontation began not with a battle, but with a conversation. Richter, desperate and running out of time, walked out of the tunnel under a white flag. He was alone, unarmed, walking slowly up the forest road toward the American positions. Henley met him at the tree line, flanked by Klein and Du Bois, weapons ready. I am Sturmbannführer Richter, the German said in perfect English. I command a unit guarding the tunnel. I wish to negotiate. We don't negotiate with SS officers, Henley said flatly. Then you're a fool. Richter's voice was calm, almost conversational. I have 30 men, demolition charges, and nothing to lose. If I give the order, that tunnel and everything in it will be rubble within 10 minutes. Is that what you want? What do you want? Safe passage. For myself and my men. We leave, you take the train. Everyone wins. Henley studied him. Richter looked tired, older than his years, a man who had played a bad hand as long as he could. But he also looked sincere, and that was dangerous. I can't authorize that, but I can relay the request. Do it quickly. The Red Army is 12 miles east. If they arrive first, none of us are leaving. Henley radioed London. The response was immediate and unambiguous. Stall. Armor will arrive before Soviet forces. Do not, repeat, do not allow German withdrawal. Henley looked at Richter and lied smoothly. They're considering it. 24 hours. Richter smiled thinly. "You're not a good liar, Captain, but I appreciate the effort." He turned and walked back toward the tunnel. 8 hours later, the first American tanks arrived. Epilogue: The Reckoning. The assault on the tunnel was swift and overwhelming. Sherman tanks, flanked by infantry, overran the German positions within 30 minutes. Richter surrendered without firing a shot, standing at the tunnel entrance with his hands raised, his face expressionless. Inside, the train waited like a museum exhibit, every car cataloged, every crate documented. The recovery took 3 days, gold bars loaded onto trucks, currency bundled and inventoried, art objects carefully crated for transport. The final manifest ran to 300 pages, 327 gold bars weighing over 4 tons, 17 million in foreign currency, 600 pieces of jewelry, and 43 paintings stolen from museums in France, Poland, and the Netherlands. Ernst Richter was transferred to Allied custody and eventually tried at Nuremberg. He was sentenced to 15 years, served 11, and died in 1963 in Hamburg, a broken man who had outlived his era. He never spoke publicly about the train. Jeffrey Ashworth received a commendation from the War Office and returned to academia after the war, teaching diplomatic history at Cambridge. He kept a photograph in his desk drawer, a grainy image of a train in a tunnel, proof that intelligence work, done properly, could change outcomes. Zofia Kowalska continued working for the resistance until Poland was liberated by Soviet forces. She was arrested in 1946 on suspicion of spying for the West, spent 3 years in prison, and was released during the thaw of 1956. She emigrated to London in 1958, where she worked as a translator until her death in 1989, days after the Berlin Wall fell. Captain Jack Henley returned to Yale, wrote a book about his experiences that was classified until 1997, and lived quietly until his death in 2003. He never stopped wondering what other trains were still out there, hidden in tunnels and forests, waiting to be found. The gold recovered from Operation Emberlight was returned to the central banks of occupied nations, distributed according to complex formulas negotiated at the Bretton Woods Conference. Some of the jewelry was reunited with surviving families. Most was not. The paintings were repatriated to their museums. The currency was destroyed, but the manifest was incomplete. Witnesses reported that one freight car had been detached before the Allied assault, spirited away during the chaos of the final days. Partisan records mention a secondary tunnel, never confirmed. Local legends speak of gold bars buried in the mountains, marked only by trees that no longer exist. In 2015, 2 amateur treasure hunters announced they had discovered the lost car using ground-penetrating radar. They provided coordinates, demanded finders' fees, and attracted international attention. When Polish authorities excavated the site, they found nothing but empty forest. The mystery of the frozen gold train remains unsolved. Perhaps it never existed. Perhaps it waits still, somewhere in the snow-covered mountains, guarded by silence and winter, a ghost from a war that ended 80 years ago but has never truly been laid to rest.